All right, guys, so welcome back. So now we're going to talk part two of the lecture. And what you're currently looking at right now is a video that I need you to stop this video to watch. Because one of the major ways that both the Soviet Union and the United States are going to fight each other is through what is called wars by proxy, where you're not necessarily directing the fighting from your country. You're kind of supporting the fight within another country. The US is supporting oftentimes the sides of democracy, while the communists or the Soviet Union are supporting the forces that are trying to spread communism within another country. You're indirectly fighting, almost like, think of it like a rooster fight, where people are gambling on who is going to win between two roosters in some seedy garage. So go ahead and stop this video and take a look at the ways that both these major powers are fighting each other in Korea, which is something that currently today we see the effects of. So one of the ways that the Korean War acts as a proxy war is that both the US and the Soviet Union had a lot of stake in this country, to the point that today North Korea and South Korea are divided at what is called the 38th parallel. The northern side belongs to North Korea, obviously, and it is heavily communist, whereas the South is more democratic in nature. And today, there is a border that separates North and South. And so when you hear about North Korea in the news, oftentimes you're hearing about North Korea being a super aggressor. A lot of people claim that the Korean War was a major failure for the US because obviously they weren't able to combat the threat of communism in that country. And today, North Korea is more of a threat than ever because of the fact that they are heavily involved in nuclearization and creating missiles that can essentially destroy us all. But let's go back to the 1950s and the 1960s, which has some exciting news. Stalin dies. The leader of the Soviet Union dies. And at this time period, people start thinking, does this mean the end of communism? Is the Soviet Union going to be considered a threat anymore? And a lot of people believed that, hey, maybe communism won't be that big of a threat. Maybe it won't spread all over the world. What's going to happen? Not so fast, US, because in 1957, the Soviets launched one of their very first satellites into outer space that they refer to as Sputnik #1. And when the Americans and the rest of the world found out that the Soviets had the technology and the resources to launch one of the world's first satellites into space, it really caused a panic because they started to believe, well, why are they launching a satellite into space? Are they spying on us? Are they going to destroy us? What's happening with Sputnik 1 that could eventually destroy us? And both the United States and the Soviet Union engage in another type of Cold War. They're not directly fighting physically in battle. They're almost fighting ideologically. This causes what is referred to as the space race. Who can get to the moon first? Who can get to the outskirts of our planet before the other country does? And we see in this magazine right here by Time Magazine that there is an obvious pressure to be the first person to land on the moon. And this gets into a bunch of conspiracy theories about the first moon landing that occurred at this time period and whether the Americans just faked it just to show the world that they'd gotten there first. But I don't know. We're not going to get into conspiracy theories today unless you like conspiracy theories. Anyway, what I'd like you to do now is, again, pause this video because now we're going to begin learning about a physical way that both the Soviet Union and the rest of the world almost fought each other in a way that is almost referred to as symbolic of the Cold War. And this is the development in what is referred to as the Berlin Wall. So go ahead and stop this video, and I'd like you to watch this video on the rise and fall of the Berlin Wall. So as you can see, the development of the Berlin Wall is going to act almost like this physical barrier that separates East from West, communism from democracy. And as the video mentioned, Berlin was almost like in a sea of red. It was in a sea of the portion of Germany that was given to the Soviet Union after World War II. And by this time, we get the election of a man who's referred to as Nikita Khrushchev, and he becomes the new leader of the Soviet Union. And what he does is that he orders forces to be removed from West Berlin. the Allies, the Americans, the French, the British all need to remove forces from Berlin. Otherwise, he was threatening to build a wall. And the Allies did not end up removing some of their forces, and the wall was built. And if you can see this picture here, the wall ended up being there from 1961 to 1989, when the wall eventually did fall. But for the longest period in history, this wall became symbolic of almost a curtain that separated the Soviet Union, communism, from the liberal West. And as the video mentioned, there was a lot of attempts at escaping Berlin to reach the other side, and oftentimes it ended in tragedy. Nikita Khrushchev, the leader of the Soviet Union this time period, once said about Berlin, and please mind my language, he said that Berlin was the testicles of the West. Every time I want to make the West scream, I squeeze on Berlin. So Berlin was almost kind of like this city that was the child in between this nasty divorce. You kind of manipulate the child to kind of get back at the person that you're divorcing from. The Berlin Wall is going to be a symbol of the Cold War. It is going to cause, it's going to cause this tension that isn't resolved until the 1980s and late 1980s, I apologize. Now, let's look at another threat in the Cold War. Again, we're not seeing a lot of fighting, but we're seeing almost kind of like both sides kind of show the other side, what are you going to do? Look what I have. Look at what we did. They're not engaging in a hot war as was engaged in World War I or World War II. They're engaging against each other in almost like an ideological who's who has what kind of war. Now, this map that you see before you are the 9 countries that today have access to nuclear weapons. And this is all a result of the Cold War. Obviously, Russia and the United States both have access to nuclear weapons. But today you hear more about North Korea right here having a lot of nuclear weapons that could destroy us all in a matter of seconds. And this is something that is still in the minds of many people. If we think about our current president, Donald Trump, he has the ability to engage in nuclear war at the drop of a hat. We can see through this tweet, I'll move my little camera over. He once tweeted on January 2nd, 2018, North Korean leader Kim Jong-un just stated that the nuclear button is on his desk at all times. Will someone from his depleted and food-starved regime please inform him that I have a nuclear button, but it is much bigger and more powerful than his, and my button works. So even today, some people argue that we're still almost in somewhat of a Cold War with other communist countries, but this day and age, it could go nuclear rather than the types of wars that we're seeing in World War I and World War II. Now, furthermore, this isn't anything new. Cold War using missiles or nuclear war isn't something that just is something that is from our modern day and age. There was a period in time in American history, 13 days, where the United States was going to be obliterated, gone, wiped off the map. And we were this close to engaging in full-blown nuclear war in 1962. And this event and crisis became known as the Cuban Missile Crisis. Now, what I'd like you to do is I'd like you to pause this video and watch the video that is currently on this slide, and we'll return. So now that you have the opportunity to watch that video, we're going to turn our attention to Europe again. And if we're looking at this picture right here, this is a political cartoon that kind of shows you just how the Cold War is playing out. If you notice, this is a picture of Stalin, and anywhere that you see on the map that is in deep dark black, it refers to countries that are deeply and heavily in the communist country of Russia. Whereas anything in a little grid shows you that Soviet bloc, those countries that are almost like puppet governments to the Soviet Union. They almost answer to the Soviet Union and are communist in themselves. Anything in almost that like diagonal line are countries that are communist or are influenced by communist countries. But the most worrisome concern about this political cartoon is, where is communism going to go into next? And if you notice on the map, you see a lot of question marks over countries that we consider to be more democratic in nature, like France and Sweden. And this cartoon almost makes it seem like, you know what, if we don't stop these communists from enveloping more people into this communist bloc, it could spread to the western parts of Europe. And before we actually talk about that, we got to go back to Russia to understand this next part of the lecture. In the reading that was assigned to you over the past few weeks and days, we've been learning that Stalin was a dictator of the Soviet Union, and he was horrible in his control of the people. He purged a lot of intellectuals, a lot of officers. There was heavy censorship. He used terror in a way that Hitler also did. And he's also referred to and known for using what are called the gulags, work camps, where he essentially arrested people that were violating a lot of the collectivization that was going around. A lot of enemies were thrown into work camps and basically starved and worked to death. But once he dies, as I mentioned earlier, we get the election of a man named Nikita Khrushchev. And Nikita Khrushchev is going to try to disassociate himself with the cruel policies of Stalin in something that is referred to as de-Stalinization, trying to rid the Soviet Union of the ugliness and all the horrible policies that were enacted under Joseph Stalin. So under his policy of de-Stalinization, he's going to end those labor camps. He's going to reduce the secret police. He's going to show himself that he's a little bit more open-minded than Stalin was as a dictator. He's also going to allow for more intellectual liberty. A lot of the people that got arrested and put into these gulags or work camps were intellectuals that wrote books that critiqued the communist government. He's going to allow those people to essentially be released from those work camps, and there's going to be a lot more intellectual liberty. Now, if we go back to the history of the Soviet Union, one of your ed puzzles was on Lenin's new economic policy in 1922. And we remember, hopefully from the ed puzzle video, that this is an example of an economic policy under Vladimir Lenin, the founder, the mind behind the Russian Revolution in 1917, in which a lot of the resources under Tsar Nicholas II, the last Tsar of Russia, they were putting a lot of the efforts into World War I. Lenin, when he came into power, said, you know what? We want a communist revolution, but you know what? I'm going to chillax. I'm going to allow people to have what is called state capitalism. I'm going to let those peasants sell a little bit of their private resources. I'm going to essentially kind of do everything that communists would almost argue against. And sometimes people say that Vladimir Lenin was almost a sellout. I thought you wanted a socialist government where everyone gives to the state and then the state redistributes. If you remember, during World War I, a lot of the peasants were forced to hand over the food that they grew in order to feed the soldiers, as well as feed the armies that were engaged in civil war with each other during the Russian Civil War to topple the Tsarist regime and implement communism. So Lenin was a little bit more open-minded to capitalist ideas of free enterprise. But then we also remember the ed puzzle video where when Stalin came into power, he implemented something called the FiveYear Plan, which was a complete reversal of Lenin's state capitalism. He wanted to industrialize Russia, make it a big player on the world stage. And he really focused on implementing new energy sources like coal, oil, and steel, but at the cost of eliminating private enterprise, making it so that people couldn't have private things to sell. Everything that they grew had to be given to the state in what was called collectivization. It introduced what was referred to as socialized farming, where people grew and gave to the government, grew and gave to the government. And in return, people were starved because they gave everything to the government and oftentimes died because of these cruel policies. And if you weren't a player, you were essentially sent to the gulags, which this slide references led to collectivization. Individual farms belong to the government, which is an idea of communism. They wanted to have a surplus grain to feed the new workers of this new industry that was being implemented under the FiveYear Plan. And it benefited the economy, but at the expense of a lot of people dying. It led to a lot of wide deaths. It led to famine. The peasant population died at the expense of Stalin. Sometimes people say that Stalin killed more people than Hitler ever did. But Nikita Khrushchev's different. He wants to de-Stalinize Russia. So what does he do that makes himself very different from Stalin? He's going to focus on agriculture, exporting agriculture. Nikita Khrushchev visits America at this time period and notices that Americans love to grow corn. Randomly, he gets excited about all the corn that is grown in the Midwest, and he comes back to the Soviet Union and says, we're going to grow corn. And so he focuses his economy on growing corn, and corn doesn't grow very well in the Soviet Union. peasants traditionally grew barley and wheat and things that were more natural to the environment of Russia. He kind of forced them to grow corn, and it really did nothing for the economy. As a matter of fact, it's going to tank. It's going to lead to a lot of crops dying, a lot of hungry peasants, a lot of the breadlines are going to grow. And oftentimes people said that Nikita Khrushchev's policy of trying to disassociate him with Stalin almost was a failure in itself. Now, this next part of this lecture is going to focus on those countries that are in the Soviet bloc, those countries that are trying to, in a way, they're not trying to, but they're being influenced a lot by the Soviet Union. This cartoon right here, oftentimes people talk about what is called an Iron Curtain. And the reason that it's called an Iron Curtain is because there was almost like this metaphorical barrier between the West and the East. And once you went under the Iron Curtain, you were in what was referred to as communist land. And one of those places that was part of the Soviet bloc, these areas that are puppet governments to the Soviet Union, was a place called Hungary. And in 1956, Hungary was under the control of Moscow, or the Soviet Union, in 1945. But there was a lot of growing anti-Soviet resentment. When Stalin dies, it's almost like people take this opportunity to kind of like, hey, maybe we can fly free. We don't want to be controlled by the Soviets anymore. And within Hungary, there's this growing dissent movement that is going to be really propelled into power by the election of a man whose name is Imre Nagy. And in this slide, you kind of see a little picture of him. On November 1st in 1956, Hungary is going to self-declare itself a free nation. They are going to rebel against everything that the Soviets implemented in Hungary. The Soviets made it difficult for people in Hungary to control what was taught in schools. There was censorship. There was a lack of freedom. Basically, if you didn't answer to the Soviet Union, you would face cruel punishments. But Imre Nagy is promising people, I can get you out of this situation. Unfortunately, it doesn't work, because even Nikita Khrushchev is not going to allow one of his little Soviet countries, one of the Soviet countries in the Soviet bloc, to escape. After this uprising in Hungary, where they're trying to break free from Soviet control, 3 days in, Soviet tanks were sent in to crush the rebellion. Do you get it? Because his name is Nikita Khrushchev. Crush. I wish you were here so you could laugh at my stupid joke. Anyway, as we see in this little animated picture, or GIF, whatever you want to pronounce it, I say GIF. You see that those ducks from this really classic video game from the 80s, those are the Soviet countries that are trying to flee from Soviet control in Russia, and Nikita Khrushchev is not going to allow one to fly away at all costs. So the results of this uprising, 30,000 people were killed trying to leave the Soviet Union. This was not going to be a possibility. 200,000 of them are going to flee to the West in fear of the punishments that are going to result for this attempt to leave the Soviet Union. And Nagy, the guy that gets elected, is going to be executed and buried in an unmarked grave. That's the ultimate insult as someone who is put to death. And fortunately for the Soviet Union, not for Hungary, Soviet rule is going to be reestablished in that area of the East. So in summary, what have we learned so far throughout this entire lecture? The Cold War was all about containment, preventing the ideologies on both sides from spreading. From the Soviet point of view, you don't want capitalism or democracy to spread into your part of the world. If you're American and even parts of Western Europe, you don't want communism to spread to your areas because they perceive it as a major threat to the ideas of liberalism, the ideas of the Enlightenment, if we think back to our studies in that time period. Both sides also engage in developing nuclear weapons, because when you develop nuclear weapons, you also alter the balance of power. You now have a clout, as people would say. Both sides also, like in previous months that we've learned in this class, Europeans love to seek alliances. The Western parts of the world, like France, Great Britain, parts of the Netherlands, are going to join what is referred to as NATO. Whereas the communist countries and in the Soviet bloc, they're going to join alliance system called the Warsaw Pact, or sometimes it's referred to as ComCon. Throughout the Cold War, one of the major features of the Cold War was the development of the Berlin Wall, which is almost going to be like the symbol of the West being divided from the East. And it's not going to fall until the late 1980s, 2 years after I was born. I was born when the Soviet Union was in its last final years. The Soviet Union also saw a lot of major economic changes from Lenin's new economic policy, where he allowed peasants to kind of sell a little bit of their stuff, have a little bit of private property, to a major change with Stalin with his 5-year plan that industrialized Russia, but at the cost of collectivization and starvation of the peasants. The Soviet Union, at the end of the day, through this lecture, proved to the world that none of its Soviet bloc countries are going to be allowed to leave. And if you try, there's going to be deadly consequences for those that attempt to do that. So to end this video, I want you to make sure that you have really focused in on some of the information that I presented throughout the video. When we return back to class, we're going to finish the last bit of this information and basically end the major highlights of AP Euro. So thanks for joining me. I will see you in class next week, not next year.